All right, everybody. Today is Monday, August 7th, 2017, and this is the biweekly Architecture Special Interest Group for Kubernetes. So without further ado, I want to make sure that you know that our agenda and notes are available at bit.ly/sig-architecture. And my name is Jace Singer-Dumars. I am co-lead with Brian Grant. And we are happy to have this meeting to discuss all things Kubernetes architecture. So to dig right into the agenda, a little bit of explanation about how this became the top item on the backlog. Essentially, during the last office hours, there was a group of people who discussed prioritization for our time here. And essentially what we saw as a critical missing link is the ability to submit and ratify architectural proposals, because a lot of the work that's going to be coming through this group is oriented toward decision-making and vetting whether architectural decisions made in SIGs or by individuals are consistent with the long-term vision of that. And what we need to do is have a process in order to review those and ratify them. So the first bullet point is really to talk about how we as a group accomplish that. And there's various consensus models and also a deep proposal by Caleb from CoreOS here to talk about mirroring some of the things that are happening in other communities, specifically Rust. So what I would love for everybody to do is take a look at that proposal, even if we do so now, because that will be part of why we or what we're discussing. So having some background on that would be helpful. All right, I don't know if Brian is on here. I believe he's supposed to be, but I don't see him. So so in terms of proposals, there's sort of this debate about what is the best way to present the proposal initially. And what I think we've got a few different ideas, and I think Caleb's proposal gets into the actual submission mechanism. So Caleb, are you here? And are you willing to talk a bit about your proposal?
Yeah, I am here. I'm happy to. Okay. So I guess high level, I believe it would be nice to combine some of the things we put into design proposals today in one centralized place, and use the design proposal to kind of rally around why we're proposing a change. I have noticed it's pretty difficult to generate release notes, and it would be nice to raise the bar, or I guess raise the quality of those design proposals to include a motivation, possibly examples about the change that is being proposed, so that as a community we could come back and summarize that information for various different audiences. One is users, when a change is merged at some point during the release cycle. It would be nice to be able to generate a roadmap for people who build on top of Kubernetes and are interested in following along on our progress. And it would be nice to have a place where the links to the issues, once a change is actually started to be developed, so you could go back and see what is that motivation, and what are those examples, why this change is important once development has begun.
So just a quick question about the scope of change. So, I mean, change can be a lot of different things depending on where you're at in the release cycle, and if it's a feature versus some sort of shift in approach to an existing implementation. So it's almost in the bug fix category. Do you have an idea of scope around what would constitute a change?
Yeah, I mean, so I've linked a couple examples of things that I've seen that I think could fall into this process, but I would imagine it's essentially, I mean, I want it to be up to the SIGs to be able to opt out of a process for minor pull requests, like our syntax, like adding a test. So things that wouldn't get a release note may be exempted, but I would like SIGs to be explicit about what they consider change worthy to receive comments on in a more formalized process. So I think most changes should go through this process, at least changes proposed by established community members. I think the on-ramp could be a little bit different for smaller things, but that I think SIGs need to be explicit about what they consider to be a change of that magnitude or not.
So is there any risk in the architectural committee or whoever is reviewing these changes as becoming a bottleneck? So basically a limiting factor on the ability to get things through?
That is a possibility, but I would like to see the actual process handled by the SIGs themselves. So even though the repository is centralized, access to the repository should be distributed and federated at the SIG level. And so hopefully that wouldn't become my bottleneck. I imagine in the beginning, there would be probably some additional editorial help to ensure that the chain sets are high enough quality in terms of just, copy. But I don't envision the process being a bottleneck to a small group of people, at least no worse than our current SIGs are able to service pull requests and issues today.
And how does that architectural consistency get applied to these changes? So if the SIGs are approving, how do you make sure SIG-X doesn't go off into the weeds with something that's not architecturally consistent?
Right, and I guess that would be, so you would have to require someone from perhaps the SIG or from the steering committee to be also looking at RFCs. I mean, hopefully cross-cutting SIG work would be chartered under some cross-SIG working group, but I think there are a bunch of details we need to sort out as the governance talks materialize into concrete recommendations for the project. Right now, there's nothing to prevent that. So you could imagine, so Phil has a proposal for API changes, and you could imagine that API changes get reviewed under SIG architecture because they are by definition cross-cutting. But I think that's still needs more work for those particular types of changes. I don't think they are the vast majority of changes, but I definitely agree we need to cover that case.
Cool. Are there other questions for Caleb regarding this? And Joe, we're going to hit your question here in a second too.
So I have one question where I don't think I heard the phrase Google Docs mentioned at all. Generally speaking, when I talk to folks about moving to Markdown as quickly as possible, the pushback that I get is that Google Docs is a much better medium for quick collaborative iteration, as well as commenting on specific portions of a doc in a way that doesn't require that you follow some specific style of formatting or whatever. I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
I guess personally, I disagree. I mean, I come across a doc around at least once a week that does not have the correct ACLs applied to it when I tried to open it, such that the ability to collaborate in real time is not utilized by the ACLing scheme.
So Caleb, that's Caleb, right?
Yep.
So, I mean, I would say I have almost the opposite experience, having done PR-based proposals and discussions. And the problem with PR-based proposals is that there is effectively a barrier for every single comment, whereas the barrier on the Google Doc usually happens once or at the time it's transferred. So it's basically changing. Everyone pays a little bit of cost in the PR to someone pays an upfront and an at most cost. Like, I don't know that, I'd be worried, which is, I feel like that's a decision that the proposal authors have already used extensively and found better, and maybe we need to measure it to make sure it's actually better. But I'd be worried about us saying that, like, it's not working, because that's not been my experience.
Yeah, I would second it. Let's see her speaking. So I would propose to focus on the Google Docs, as Clayton mentioned, because of the benefits of Google and Google Docs and so on, instead of PRs for the early stage of some drafts and documents and so on. And when we are moving to some like public space, so PR can work better. At the same time, Google Docs should work better for the continuous process of updating docs, updating some information and so on, because we may really stuck with some PR with like trying to submit and update some ideas.
And maybe I missed it.
Wait, can I jump in here? I think we're in the weeds. I think the bigger issue here is, what are the documents we want to produce? What is the workflow for who produces those, who consumes them, who approves them? And then the mechanics of how we record it. I agree that that's important, and I have opinions there also, but in my mind, that takes a second place to exactly what is the process that we want to have here.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say maybe I was misinterpreting the question, which is I would agree that at the end of the day, the form of how the documents are produced does need to meet a standard that we've already kind of established of, a PR and changes in a repo with a history and a version for long-term maintenance. So I'm not disagreeing that it cannot stay in Google Docs, or that it should stay in Google Docs.
I would say, just as a very low bar, and then I'll hand off to Joe here, like there's a to-do in the proposals directory that says document our proposal process, right? I would just love to, at a bare minimum, have a standardized format for what a proposal should be. And I think, Caleb, what you put forth is a really awesome start at like, what are the big headings that a proposal for a significant amount of work should address? I've had a number of people internally ask me this sort of question, and I've had to go just organically point to a number of well-written design proposals and point out the ones that are, like calling out objectives versus non-goals, the ones that are calling out alternative and considerations and stuff. I think having all of that as a standard template would be a pretty low effort, high value thing that we could do. I don't know if this is the group that owns it, and I'm not sure this is the group that has to sign off on all proposals, but there's nothing there right now.
Yeah, I would say this group is a commenter on proposals and has some level of authority, but like we should be clear about who actually is approving the proposals, and it should be the technical and process coming together at the point of approval. Like if SIGs have to go through this group to get approval for a proposal, that's bad. But if SIGs simply just have to make sure that this group is aware and other groups are aware, then that's somewhat consistent with what we said already.
All right, I'm confused, honestly, because I feel like we're conflating release planning with architectural planning. And the proposal process that you have here, Caleb, it really looks like it's filtered around, or it's rotated around that release process, and really optimal for understanding what's going into each release so that we can plan for that. I think that's a really important thing. I think we should be careful not to conflate that. And this is the email exchange that we had over the last couple of days here. I think it's really important not to conflate that with long-term, architectural planning. Like as we try and plan things, I think one of the places where I look at the features repo, and I think it's actually fallen down, is we have conflated those things. And so we find that we have these issues that are open forever. They become unwieldy. They mix evaluating the merits of the proposal with the mechanics of actually getting that proposal out there, and I think it ends up becoming just too much in general for folks. I think if we look at I mean, what Clayton's saying here is that let's actually figure out where true north is on issues, and then we can figure out how to stage that in over releases. And we've seen this with the features repo where, we started out having features that were going to actually be longitudinally over multiple, releases, and then you're going to use the same issue as you go from alpha to beta to GA. And then over time, we've actually sort of said, no, a release is actually the amount of work that actually fits into a specific. The feature ends up being the amount of work that fits into a specific release. And then from the feature, we actually point to the design doc but that design doc is kind of, you know, meh. There's no approval, there's no process, there's no format, there's no status to that. And so I think RFC, you know, it's interesting that, like, you know, in IETF land, RFC actually means standards. It means request for comment, which is different from sort of a change. It's sort of like, here's the standard of the thing that we want to get to. Here's the architecture, and implementations are handled separately from that.
And I also think, just as a side, some of the concerns that we have around stabilization, TikTok, et cetera, really tie into, we're not actually setting up the longitudinal long-term arc such that you can plan across multiple releases, where a tick and a talk just become whether you deliver parts of it and how they're enabled. Because absolutely there will be things that take more than one release to drive to fruition, and that may require them to be exposed in some form of the code, even if they're not explicitly enabled and supported, because it's impossible to do big bang style chops. And that's not even what we want to do, right? We would never drop a 6-month change in on the last week of the release and then mark it alpha. We want to slowly and cautiously move forward across multiple releases on long-running important objectives.
So I think I guess for my original motivations for proposing a change, so I'm getting an echo of one, but that's okay, is about the very basic, it goes to the basics of governance. It's what are we working on and why, which is not necessarily related. I mean, it is related to the release process, but it's just fundamentally about communication, about, again, what we're working on and why what we're working on is important. Now, that, because it is difficult to ascertain that today, it does have consequences for the release process. But I guess I want to step back to propose a general mechanism for communicating what we're working on and why, and have a general mechanism for having people propose changes to the project. And so that's, you could imagine that RFC in this context is interchangeable with something like the Python enhancement proposal, where you have this, we want to do this thing, this is why we believe it is important, here's an example of how you would consume it. And a SIG would say, yes, that's in roadmap, this is not in, or no, this is not in roadmap, so we'll table that. Beyond that motivation and high-level design goals, then I think you can start talking about how you would go about implementing that change, to your point, Joe. And I think, yes, these are definitely different phases of a development process. But I want to get alignment on what we think is a reasonable process first, because what we have right today is falling down at scale. I think if you were to compare our release notes, for example, and that's the end of the process. So given our current development process, what can one glean from the information that's available? If you compare our release notes to other projects that are, one, more established, or two, smaller, I think you would find much to be desired in terms of users being able to consume these changes, because they are talked about in a way that allows them to reason about what is new, why you would want to install the next version of Kubernetes. And my concern is about reducing that barrier, so to reduce the adoption cost of the project itself at release time. So looking at the end here, what do we need at the beginning when a change is just an idea in someone's eye?
I think. Go
ahead, Jace.
I was going to say, I think you're spot on, Caleb, that we do have a tactical issue, and it manifests grossly during the release process. That's when it's just aching and sitting out in plain view. I think what Joe's concern is, and I think that we need to find a way to reconcile this, is that the content of the changes is important, but the idea of an overarching architectural narrative that has cohesion across 2-3 point releases or even major releases is not necessarily satisfied by this more tactical implementation of it. it has, the tactical implementation definitely starts to align things, because ideally, let's say, you know, one of the SIGs props up a proposal. That proposal should definitely say, here's how this ties into the architectural roadmap. We're splitting this repo out because architecturally speaking, we want to have a wider variety of separate repositories to work on. So that definitely should be an element in the proposal process, in my opinion. But it doesn't necessarily fix this problem that we all feel in our bones about, you know, Kubernetes is this thing that's marching forward release after release, and there is a chance that we're going to hit an architectural cliff somewhere that we're not aware of. And so really understanding those aggregate patterns and implementation known anti-patterns and whatnot, and kind of heading those off, and seeing what's happened to other projects that are more mature that have faced similar issues of scale. Those things aren't necessarily accommodated super well in a point process. We need to figure out how to reconcile those two things together. And I agree that yours is a tactical implementation of that, but there's a separate overarching thing that so far I cannot figure out how we're approaching that problem in a really cohesive way.
I'll give a concrete example here. I mean, you know, we have underway this effort to essentially break Kubernetes out into a bunch of you know, extensible things with API aggregation and that type of thing. It's awesome. There's been a ton of work. It's impacting everybody. We don't have a design doc for that. That really sort of covers out the why and the how and where we're going with that. And that's the type of thing that I wish we had, and I wish you know, a lot of the pain that we're going through would be lessened if that was communicated well and clearly across a larger swath of the community.
And I agree that as a concrete example, that is something that I believe, like, again, I guess, I at least as I see it, that the challenge with that particular change, how do you break up the repository, because there's no place to track that effort. There's no kind of document that could be approved that would, given a strategy for doing so, that we could agree on, that what are the goals of breaking up the repository, and what are we trying to accomplish? How are you going to measure success?
This is more than just breaking up the repository. I mean, this is an architectural change for what Kubernetes is at its core, right?
Right. I think that, and that's broken out down into at least two phases. There's one, what is the architecture you're trying to accomplish, you're trying to implement? And two, what is the actual repository structure that mirrors that intent? Now, certainly you could make the architectural changes and still have the monorepo, but I think we have decided as a community that we don't want the monorepo. So now both of those changes are now somewhat tied together. But I agree that those are two distinct changes. But in this case, they're tied.
So yeah, so I mean, I would love to have a process for tracking, you know, what is it that anybody's doing in a particular release. I'd love to see that roll up to some sort of, at least for a certain size and aspect of change, roll up to some different document process for architectural change and direction. And these things can separately and be named different things. I don't think we have to come up with the grand unified process that covers both of these.
You know, when I was at Rally, they had a really good way of dealing with these. These were sort of these, they called them rocks, but they were problems that need to be broken down inherently, but were very large. And so essentially you would take a rock and you would break it into a number of epochs that would happen over time in a staged fashion. And that breaking down part between the sort of monolithic problem and the implementation of epochs, that was a really good insertion point for architecture, because that is the point at which you see a lot of long-term decisions go awry. Either because you're trying to implement it too tactical level and you do things that necessarily have to be reworked later and you introduce a lot of waste, or you don't have the right people in the room to make a decision about something and you pick a direction and run with it and it's just inherently the wrong direction. So what I think that we're seeing is breaking down the monolith is definitely what I would have called a rock at that point. And maybe we need to call these major work efforts out and actually wrap some sort of agile process around how we approach them, because right now the way we're doing it is not necessarily good. And I think there is a distinct lack of visibility in terms of the overall arch of those things that we need to do. And I don't see any work product that can be applied. There's no way to actually track the work. So that's I think that we're one level above the regular project at that point, and we need to find a way to manage those large scale things.
What I would love to do is I'd love to actually put together a process on how we want to organize what's going into the community proposals, and maybe do that in a different repo directory. How do we organize, tag, track, what's current, what's not current, what's deprecated, what supersedes what, that type of thing with those design proposals, and really encourage folks to if they're doing stuff that cuts across multiple SIGs, that starts to have an architecture smell to it, to actually go through there, and let's try and keep that be as high content as possible. I think that it should be, I'm not sure that every proposal that goes in there necessarily has to go through and get some, I don't know what the heck SIG PM does, to be honest, Paul. So I think it'd be great if every proposal goes through there that impacts multiple SIGs. I don't think necessarily all of those have to be heard officially by SIG architecture. But I think that we're going to see a lot of them will benefit tremendously by actually having those eyes on those proposals, and it'll ease implementation when we have that stuff decided upon from the get-go.
So I think that Paul's question about what is SIG PM versus this work, I think that's a really interesting thing that gets into the heart of a lot of it, which is, what is the horizon that any particular SIG is looking at? SIG architecture is a SIG that has a 6-month to multi-year purview. If we're in the weeds of what's happening this month, we're doing it wrong, or we're behind the ball, and that's not where SIG architecture needs to be. SIG PM is a release level purview, and that's really maybe a release ahead. But specifically, what are the features that are going to be implemented in a particular release? How does that tie into the overarching architectural roadmap and runway? And then SIGs are at a more tactical level, which is really the release or less, and making sure that the work that's being done is consistent with the 2 layers of product management and architectural management. So I think that if we look about horizon, that almost by nature defines what are the responsibilities of any particular group. I mean, obviously SIGs have an architectural concern. If you're writing a feature, say like the PKI infrastructure for Kubernetes, that's not a one release thing, that's a multi-release thing. So there's elements of that, but then again, that should tie into the epics at the highest level of what's happening.
Yeah, the PKI stuff is a great example where there is no grand plan that lays out what our goals are and what we're doing there. And there's a lot of great work going on. I'm not arguing with that, but it feels like we're looking at each feature in isolation instead of actually looking at the architectural direction there. In terms of SIG PM, honestly, it's been around for a while. We haven't seen, so Paul says, I would argue that if SIG PM is really going to be the center of product management for this community, that would be the SIG that would track these things. If they are only looking a single release ahead, that is not sufficient to track the grand plans. Again, I don't see a strong connection, honestly, between SIG PM and the architectural decisions that are being made. That decision is just lacking. The right people aren't there. The right discussions aren't being had.
Yeah. Can we take a quick step back for a second? Because I feel like we're stepping out of the bounds of SIG architecture here. I'm going to sort of reiterate my ask at the beginning that what we do not have today is a standard proposal document for people to write against. There's no template that says these are the headings you should do and this is the content you should have.
But Aaron, proposal for what?
Good question. We have this big directory called design proposals. Any significant amount of work that's going to take you more than a week or two, anything you think could potentially impact the end user or could cross multiple SIGs, anything where you think you have to tell people about all the prior art that you looked at, the API changes or potentially breaking changes or potentially deprecating changes that you make, it's kind of difficult for me to give you a one-sentence summary of like, this should require a proposal or not. But I think you think in like meaningful chunks of work that are going to require a person to shepherd them along for a while, I'd probably want to put together a design proposal for that. Like if it's something I need a design document to implement against anyway, would that not be something I want the community to review to get some eyes on it before I write code?
I think some of this is clarity. You know, when we say proposal, do we mean the stuff going into a single release? Which I think that's some of Caleb's proposal here. I'm too many proposals. Or do we mean something that actually is more architectural and stretches across multiple? But Paul's saying he has his hand up, so I apologize, Paul.
That's okay. I am responding, Joe, to a possible mismatch I heard. I wasn't suggesting at all that SIG PM make architecture decisions. I was suggesting that it might be an appropriate body to track the decisions and epic arcs, similar to like what you would sort of expect from typical product management, right?
It seems strange to me that if we need to track architectural decisions and processes, that we would do that in a SIG outside of SIG architecture. Having product be concentrated in one spot and everybody go to them versus the other way around. That's the thing that I'm wondering. Like, yes, we could use product management help in terms of tracking this, but saying that SIG PM doesn't really compute for me.
Yeah, I would like to advocate a bit on behalf of SIG PM. So what we're actually doing and how does it overlap and how can it collaborate with SIG architecture? So I can see SIG architecture job mostly in the technical side and in technical strategy and the technical roadmap for Kubernetes. At the same time, at SIG PM, we're mostly focused on Kubernetes as a product, as a market product, and we're also like viewing it in the different angles, including like marketing, customer collaboration, and so on. So at SIG PM, we're likely to collaborate with SIG architecture in terms of the technical decisions. At the same time, we'd like to leave SIG architecture and like ground SIGs to work on that more. And also, we're not only focused on the per release cycle job for Kubernetes, we're also focused on the general roadmap, but again, mostly from the product perspective, not from the technical perspective.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So if you look at traditional Agile development, where you've got the product owner sitting in a team, and you've got the development team and the Scrum Master. I mean, in true Agile implementations, the product team is really the why of what's happening. And it's interesting in the Kubernetes project where the why is really more drawn out by the SIGs themselves. So people will come to a SIG and say, here's the why of what we want to do. And then the more technical vetting of architecture is to say, I understand I understand your why, it makes sense, but here's part of the how is that if you're going to do this, please don't write this code in Fortran. It'd be great if you use Go because that's an architectural standard for the project. So there's probably ways in which there's overlap and cross concerns here that work, but nobody's actually gotten together and figured those out. They're not explicit anywhere. This is just happening organically.
Also, I think I think it's useful to call out that Kube does kind of have a mission that it's had from the very beginning that came from some very idealized goals, and what we've tried to do is go from a point where that is a vision concentrated in a few people to a more organic process where we work to the benefit of the users running the platform. And so architecture originally may have meant kind of the architectural vision of the platform, but the community-driven, SIG-driven requirements and use cases has changed architecture to mean probably both some consistent vision for the overarching goals, but also the rectification of specific technical objectives that each SIG generates in isolation. And that's no different than any successful engineering project, really. I mean, I don't think that's surprising. PM generally makes sure that the user's requests are being heard, the user's voices are being heard, and sometimes that's in the SIGs and sometimes it isn't. And there's a technical oversight, which is the project internally healthy and is able to accomplish, new, react to changing goals, but also have like a long-term vision for the technology.
I think you're spot on, Clayton. I mean, those are, having managed many engineering groups over the years, that's definitely, those are the core components of success.
I definitely agree with Aaron, though, that like, and to Joe's point, I feel like we want to and we believe that we should have a concrete proposal process. We should try as much as possible to take what we have today, codify it over the next few weeks or months into a gradually increasing process. Is a proposal description and process by itself sufficient to move the project in a forward direction, such that there is at least some place where people go to articulate design changes that cross boundaries? And the answer is probably yes. I mean, is there disagreement about that?
I don't think the proposal process alone is sufficient for that.
Absolutely. I'm just saying it is a concrete tactical thing that we can all agree that we should start growing the proposal process to meet the immediate needs and then have the arc of it where we want to go with it firmly in mind in this group.
Yes. Yeah, I definitely think we need to formalize the proposal process. That's why I've been pushing that. We have a lot of newcomers on the project, and there is a fair amount of cargo culting, but there does seem to be confusion about how the process should work, especially since we moved docs to the community repo, where we don't have as many people looking at the PRs coming in. The assignment of proposal to reviewer and approver has fallen through the cracks in many cases. For the people who have been on the project for a long time, this has not been an issue because they just notify the people they want to review it, and they understand how the process works and they move forward. Although even in those cases, we've had a number of situations where work started, progressed, and even was released without wrapping up the proposal. And that's happened a number of times over the past several releases, and I would like that not to continue to happen. And if we're going to be explicit about we need more investigation, we need to be more iterative on this area. We're not really sure and we don't want to take a waterfall approach. Let's just be explicit about that. But I think that's not what happened in the cases I'm thinking about. It's more that just people didn't have the energy to wrap up the proposal and debate, and without clear approvers, for example, closing down comments from random participants just took too much energy. So
is there like two short-term parts that we could concretely tackle, such as a formalization of the existing process, a discussion about the concrete what requires a proposal, and then some group of people who can help shepherd existing proposals into that, hey, there's a set of people who are expected to help get proposals as they are formatted into the mechanism that already exists?
Yeah, I think we can definitely break this up into multiple pieces. Like someone could go draft a template. I think we have a few stabs at this already. Someone just needs to create a PR, and we can merge the PR and iterate on the template. Some of the other items you mentioned, getting a tag team together to make sure the existing proposals are moving and getting discovered by the right people and so on, sounds like a great idea. I would actually like someone to reorganize the design proposals directory by SIG, so that we could use some of the standard auto assignment mechanism, or alternatively extend the mechanism so that we can add more metadata to proposals to facilitate auto assignment and fit with the reviewer approver mechanism. So I think there are things that can be done on multiple fronts, and then separately, as I mentioned in email while I was on my way here, we need to clarify how approvers and reviewers get assigned and what to do if multiple people want the right to approve or things like that. For PRs, it's not so much been an issue. For proposals, it's more of an issue. Like who can say, make the go, no-go decision, for example. So yeah, I think breaking up the problem and starting to make progress seems like a great thing to do. I don't want to boil the ocean here. I think things are happening regardless of what we do here. So anything we can do will be an improvement and help things move forward.
What do we think about the idea of having some way of tracking those large architectural rocks, like breaking up the repositories, PKI? I don't know. There's probably a half dozen of these really big things that we all know are sort of there, but they don't have really a good paragraph around them.
Should we have a Kubernetes project HighLevel Ethics that covers everything that's too big to have a proposal right now? Should there be a proposal for the super bigs?
Yeah, and that's what I was starting on with the doc. And the doc needs to be updated and broken up and checked into Markdown, and we can do that incrementally as well. But there are some long-standing positions that I think inform people actively working on the project, like which functionality we expect to be in kube control versus on the server side, and why that is.
And maybe another way to say that, Brian, is that we have a huge amount of very important things that haven't been flushed to persistent storage in a way that's discoverable. To some of the points like we've talked about, well, we need to decide what the process is before we write it down. I think from the architecture side, that argument's a little bit less valid, which is there are long-standing ideas and principles that inform the design of Kubernetes, and flushing those into a form, flushing those to disk is more important than litigating the process, because no matter what the new process is, those are still bedrock assumptions. If people wish to disagree with them, doing that discussion in the open is actually more productive than using the process to relitigate those. And I'm not trying to frame the people who want to relitigate them as bad. I'm trying to say, like, having the discussion on the PR is the best possible outcome about a concrete proposal that defines a fundamental Kubernetes mindset architectural item.
Yes.
I think
just to reiterate, I guess, what Brian and Clayton said, though, I cannot underscore enough the need to just document the state of the world today so we can get out of tribal knowledge of what the process is. I'm getting requests, and I sort of just have to make off the top of my head the idea that, well, I've seen other people do Google Docs, and I think if you copy paste what this good looking proposal does here and try to include these headings, like, please, can we just, that seems to be, and I think I heard that as a concrete action item. I'm happy to be a reviewer on that PR. I don't have the time to put that content forward today.
Hey, this is Paul Mori. I have such a template that I can easily pull requests in the next couple days that I've used to great success in nearly all prior Kubernetes proposals I've written, which have been numerous.
Sounds great. I mean, just to see a big to-do document our proposal process in that design proposals directory makes it really difficult to explain to other people what I mean when I say that sounds like something you should write a design proposal for, and it increases the burden. And I'm sure you could make the argument that that means I should take on the initiative of drafting a design proposal process and documenting the state of the world, but I'm hopeful we can all agree that takes time. And I already did my part in documenting the way the owner's file stuff works today.
So it sounds like there's two action items coming out of this. One of them is to come up with a architectural proposal process. Call it rocks, call it epics, whatever, right? It's this idea of let's talk about, come up with a process where we can actually start talking about these big things that we're trying to make happen. And then there's a second thing, I'm going to call them architecture notes, which are sort of like capturing some of the sort of, gestalt for how we think about things and getting that stuff down on paper, virtual paper, perhaps in a way that's sort of bite-sized so that people can sort of, work their way through them in sort of little bits. There's just so much of that stuff that we think we all agree on because we've sort of worked on this stuff forever, but none of it's really written down.
I think there's a really important delineation, though, is something that we need. We have two charges. One is implementation, and then the other is the production and maintenance of standards and guidelines. So we need to be on top of what are the large architectural epics that are in flight, like the repo split out. But then we also need to be on top of the standards and guidelines that should be applied to the changes that are happening in real time. So that I think that those two things together sort of complement one another. And I think that if we pick our 6 top things that we're working on from the big picture perspective, that's going to drive a lot of this stuff out. So I would love to sit down. Maybe we could do this during the office hours or something and just do a sketch of what are those 6 things. What are the 6 things that in a year, if we say we didn't do these 6 things, then we really screwed up.
I mean, Jace, that defines the product. And that's great. No, I think it's good. I think architecture and product definition are entwined for something like Kubernetes to the point where you can't separate them out.
I think a good architecture empowers a good product, not the other way around. And also a core consumer of our architecture should be the user experience, the people who are actually contributing code. So a product is this a consumable project? So I think it's twofold.
When you say the people, when you say users, you mean end users for Kubernetes,
right? End users and contributors, those two.
Yeah, and I would say that in many ways, UX and architecture are tightly tied also.
Yeah. So we've got a lot of steps in the notes right now, and I don't see any name except maybe, I don't know. There's no names. If you want to claim one of these, please put your initials or name after it so it's clear who's going to tackle these. But I think that the proposal template is a super quick win, just to at least get us talking about what we're talking about.
I completely agree. And just to sort of try and close the loop on the architecture thing, I was hearing Clayton say that there's a lot of stuff not yet paged to disk as far as the architectural principles for Kubernetes. So I pointed to a document called architecture.md asking if that was out of date. And Brian said that doc is not out of date. So where are the principles out of date or not yet committed?
I was going to say, there's a whole bunch of things that are pieces of docs that exist but aren't well organized. So it's somewhat of Brian's architecture doc is a larger set of architecture.md, and then there's a whole host of other issues around it. There may be there has to be some commitment among people who normally feel that there's some process of we need to document more and let things stay undocumented less in order to be successful. And so maybe the flush to disk should be something ongoing that people commit to from a SIG and SIG architecture perspective as well, to try to keep flushing things to disk and to reinforce and reward that, or reinforce and nag about that.
I guess my ask was just if there's going to be a central location for this, as opposed to flushing everything to disparate files all over the disk, right?
I would say we would reorganize proposals, but I don't know why proposals because we talked about proposals with RFCs and RFPs. I don't know why they wouldn't be the place we would flush it into disk to code, to catch things that already exist. API conventions is a living document. It's one of our more successful ones, but there's a set of things around that are insufficiently clear that don't get enough attention being flushed to disk, that has caused challenges, or it's out of date. That we need to, I guess it would be try to find and break off things that need to be flushed to disk, where people who currently are relying on responding to comments about it to answer, with concrete writing things into the proposals, et cetera, that detail the current state.
Yes. I had asked, as I make comments on PR reviews or API proposals, I had been asking the authors to help convey those principles to the conventions docs and such. That has not been very successful. Maybe because I didn't gate merge of their specific thing with it, trying to democratize the process a little bit. But yeah, it may just be that we need to spend time to go do that instead of reviewing people's PRs.
Brian, is there an index of all the API reviews and sort of the context for the why and the how around that, or is it pretty ad hoc?
There is not an index of them.
Because that seems like if you want to find one thing to look at, sort of like what's happening with the project and where it's going, like looking at API deltas over time and the context around them seems to be like the one choke point that I would pick if I had to choose.
Yeah, that's like do a blame on types.go files. That's basically what you have to do right now.
Yeah, API changes are the only throat that we have to choke in this project.
But yeah, I mean, as far as architecture.md goes, I last did a flush to disk on that in March or April. I think it reflects the principles pretty well as the current state. It does not reflect the big initiatives that are in flight. That's more the Google Doc, and that needs to be flushed to Markdown. At least the parts that people agree on. And there are a bunch of other things that are like that. Like I mentioned, moving functionality out of kube control to make it work with extension APIs and things like that, or whatever it is. I mean, there are a bunch of big changes that have been in flight for some time, and it definitely would be useful to document those in some clear place.
Is anybody opposed to using Google Project, or not Google, GitHub Project for tracking that? So we actually have a board that shows what's in progress, done.
It cannot be an org level project. It would have to be a repo level project. So we need to choose a repo, like a community repo or something.
Yeah.
And I think, personally, I would like to see who changed what, when, why, and how, and where. And, it's like moving something from unapproved to approved is a big deal. And there should be an audit log for that, not just somebody dragging something in a column.
I think GitHub events now say who dragged a thing from one column to another at what time. I know at least there's an events API for each issue. You can see all the things that happen to that issue, and that includes project level transitions.
Okay.
So, okay, I'm gonna, I have on the thing, I signed up to actually sort of write down a design process. This will be part of that. I will put my opinions on there, and then we can bike shed on that till our heart's content.
Okay. We have 4 minutes left, by the way.
Anything that's not in the commit history, I think, is hard to find. Especially anything that's only visible in the audit log is basically inaccessible to almost everybody on the project.
Yeah, I mean, let me be clear. I agree. It should all be auditable via the Git commit log. I totally think that's the way going. Sorry, I thought you were referencing using a project to track this broader effort of improving our proposal process and moving issues around in that. If you're talking about a project for design proposals, yeah, Git first.
I thought we were talking about the second one.
Yeah, I'm talking about just the big level things. If somebody drags, repo breakup into done, yeah, that's going to be pretty obvious. If we're done. So I don't know. I have a vision of seeing this in my head, and I'd love to work with Joe, Brian, whoever on seeing that, because I've managed big epics like this, and I've seen it work. So I would love to see that work here. Is there anything else before we adjourn? And I want to thank everybody for a fantastic discussion here and also being very solution focused.
So I had a specific item I wanted to talk through that is a design problem that we face in Service Catalog. We don't need to do it here if folks are willing to have an offline discussion about it, but it's important to get resolved with some expedience. So it'd be great if I could get someone's time to talk through that, like Clayton or Brian.
Yeah, let's do that in email. I mean, in general,
Okay.
what I imagine for the SIG architecture meetings is we do need to make forward progress on things like the proposal process, getting stuff written down, things like that. So I do want to reserve the main meeting times for hashing that stuff out. Office hours and the alternate weeks are more for people to raise issues and come with questions and help with design discussions. But you know, if you have something that's fairly urgent, let's just do that via email or something.
Yeah.
Before we sign off, I just wanted to thank Caleb for putting together that proposal. Thank you, Caleb. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I see that as part
Yeah,
and
of
parcel of
course.
the end state for sure.
Yeah, and the thing that we need to figure out how to get more people like Caleb able to constructively contribute to this process. I didn't really have too much time to respond, and I couldn't, you know, as a gist, I couldn't really comment on it in detail. So I think one good thing about SIG architecture is we can bring these discussions out into the open and maybe get more people involved so you can make more progress.
Yeah, I think the worst thing we can do is not empower our thought leaders. We need to give a forum for people to raise these ideas, because that's how the world changes.
Yeah.
And also, if we're successful at this, it's going to be so much easier for more people to get involved, to audit the class, to see how things work, to speak up and you know, start taking this stuff on. The more we can get out of, you know, the heads of a few people, the more successful we're going to scale the project. So yeah, very excited about that.
All right, well, with that, we'll adjourn and office hours for 30 minutes the following Monday. And everybody have a great week.
Okay, so the main meetings are an hour and the office hours are 30 minutes?
Correct.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
Thanks.